Hey, how's it doing? Dr. Nate here again for Module 2.2, Men and Masculinities. We're going to be talking today about the theories of masculinity that seem to dictate the performance of masculinity, and then in turn how that is portrayed in different masculine men or non-masculine men in the media. So a little bit about the historical terrain about masculinity, right? There has been a lot of changes in regards to men and masculinity in media. First, we need to define the term man. What does it mean? Any attempt to define what a man is inevitably linked to masculinity, right? What is masculinity? For the longest time, men and women have been the dichotomous traditional gender roles, right? I'm sorry, there's like flies and shit out here. Didn't mean to cuss. Anyway, so there is men and women, right? This traditional dichotomy of what gender is, right? What sex is. And because of that, there has come with it this patriarchy, this hegemony that we talked about earlier of these performances and gender roles. So what does it mean to be a man? When you think of man, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Usually it's a man is someone who's strong, someone who is a father, someone who provides, someone who doesn't cry, doesn't show emotional, is rational. There's strength, there's all these different things tied to the traditional definition of what a man should be. And because of that, the term masculinity then involves to determine how you perform gender, how you perform being a man. Validation of men and masculinity is also something that has interested scholars because in order for masculinity to be performed, it also has to be viewed and validated, right? So that someone says, oh, you're being a man, right? A lot of times you will hear people use different types of words like be a man up, don't be a pussy, or act like a man, right? These types of things. No homo. All these things to police masculinity. So then gender is then performed. Special topics courses have kind of sprung up here and there around academia to talk about masculinity and men. And in some spaces, there has been whole institutions and whole subject areas in schools just around masculinity, studying how gender is performed specifically by men in certain social constructs and in social spaces that are tied, of course, to time and space, politics, identities, all these different types of things as well too. So when we talk about men and masculinity, we talk about this kind of historical structural ethos that surrounds this patriarchal traditional definition of what a man is. Now, as we've evolved through time, there's been different types of theories like feminist theory, queer theory that have tried to look at different types of performance of gender that aren't tied to this traditional masculinity. But in essence, when we still look at the different types of portrayals of men and masculinities in media, they're still tied to these very, what we call heteronormative and also hegemonic definitions of masculinities. And that's going to be the two theories that we operate with. We're going to talk mainly about hegemonic masculinity, and that is what we're going to operate with throughout the entire course. But I do want to mention that there is something else called deviance theory or spoiled identity that is also used sometimes in masculinity studies to study men. The basic premise of deviance theory is that anything that deviates away from social norms, that deviates away from the hegemony, is considered a deviant. Therefore, men must perform gender in these traditional patriarchal male roles so that they don't deviate from these social norms, so they're not ostracized from society, so they're not called names, and in most situations, so they're not equated to being effeminate, less than, or women, because in these traditional patriarchal roles, being a woman is still equated to weak and inferior as such. Hegemonic masculinity is a theory that I deal with a lot and publish with a lot. And the premise of this that we will go into here in just a second is basically that there is a hierarchy of masculinity where straight, cisgender, very masculine men are at the very top of the hierarchy. And then other men who perform masculinity in more effeminate or subordinate ways are then below that. And then women are at the very bottom. So people who are gay and homosexual tend to operate in the middle. And that's very important to note now because when we get to the LGBTQ section and we talk about gay men, we will look at how there's instances where gay men, in recompense for their sexuality, will behave in very heteronormative and hegemonic masculine ways to kind of regain this lost power in the hierarchy. So hegemonic masculinity then puts men in a hierarchy depending on how masculine they are. The more masculine you are, the more straight you are, the more cisgender you are, you're at the very top of the list. And then women, of course, are going to be at the very bottom in this patriarchal view of what masculinity is. And because of that, men will perform gender and police gender within one another to remain at the top of the hierarchy. So there is this kind of threat to their masculinity when it comes to effeminate behavior, when it comes to different types of gender roles. When we start talking about things like the glass ceiling and pay wage gaps, men who are at the top of the hierarchy feel threatened that they're going to lose their privilege, they're going to lose their spot, and then in recompense for that, start behaving in very misogynistic or homophobic types of ways. So what is hegemonic masculinity? This was a term coined by Connell and Messerschmitt back in the day. Masculinity is not fixed. It's actually embedded in the body or personality traits of individuals. Masculinities then are configurations of practice, right? They're performed, as Judith Butler tells us, gender is performed. And this is accomplished in social action and therefore can differ according to the gender relations in a particular social setting. This is also tied extremely to space and time. So it is now in 2019 a little bit more acceptable for men to groom themselves, right? To even pluck their eyebrows, where maybe back in 1930, 1950, that was seen as effeminate and something that was reserved only for women. Now, of course, arguably some men still think that, but we have to think of a particular specific setting tied to space, tied to time, and see how that social interaction is going to dictate how gender is then performed. The social norms that are associated with hegemonic masculinity provide meaning about appropriate patterns of masculine performance, right? So then how do you talk? How do you walk? What do you wear? How do you interact with the same gender? How do you interact with the opposite gender? How do you interact in spaces where there is a lot of emotion, right? These dictate how we perform gender appropriately to these social norms. This then performance is internalized and negotiated in each person's construction of their gender identity, how they interpret being a man, and then how they in turn act on being a man, how they perform gender. This appropriate patterns of performance are not predetermined. They're the cultural template of what desirable masculinity is. And this cultural template, again, tied to culture, we talked about this at the beginning of the semester. So this cultural template is going to be different. How men act in Mexico compared to how men act maybe in Middle Eastern regions, compared to how men act in Japan, to United States, to Canada in 1960 versus 2019, versus political spaces versus religious spaces, right? All of this is tied to some sort of cultural template. And that becomes the template of what desired masculinity is and should be. And then it's kind of configured and reconfigured in a way that we definitely are able to position what a man is, what a woman is, right? Because again, we're thinking about patriarchy and we're thinking about hegemony. There's this dichotomy of sex and gender, and there's only these two that exist in this patriarchy. And how we structure this gender performance and the gender roles that go along with it. So that's kind of what hegemonic masculinity is. Scholars who have studied these different types of masculinities, hegemonic masculinity, and the social power that is associated with these hierarchical structures, usually look at how it relates with men to men, men to women, homosexual men, transgender individuals, and people who are consider themselves gender non-conforming or gender non-binary, right? So then when we look at how masculinity is then performed, we see how that is tied to gender, how that is tied to sexuality, how it's tied to sexual orientation, and then of course to the culture, the social settings around them. There exists this kind of mediated relationship, right? This relationship between the viewer and the content of how men see these collective images and what they consider to be the ideal patterns of gender performance to better understand the way in which they perform gender, right? How is a man on television performing how to be a man? And if you're young and you're looking up at these individuals, maybe you have some kind of admiration for them, you are looking at how they perform gender, you want to perform gender kind of the same way. And you try to make sense of these different patterns. There could also be some kind of cognitive dissonance when you're looking at this and you're like, I have this idea in my head of what masculinity should be, but that's not how it's being performed on Pose. That's not how it's being performed in Kimmy Schmidt. This isn't how it's being performed in all these different things. And so then there's this cognitive dissonance and where the man has to then kind of try to interpret their own performance, what they're seeing, and how do they negotiate that. That also happens though when people who who do not identify as men, right? They can be women or gender nonconforming, see this performance and then also think, is that really how I think a man should act? Maybe I think they should act in a different way. When we think about hegemonic masculinity, we also think about complicit masculinity, where women and people who are non-gender binary or non-gender conforming also say, no, this is how a man should act, and we're going to go ahead and police it as well too, and tell our sons, tell our brothers, tell men around us, act like a man. Be a man, do these different things. So masculinity then becomes policed by everybody around you as well too. I put a link to this on your Blackboard. This is American Male, and MTV had this contest, a viewer contest for people to make their own mini movies, and this is the one that won, I think back in 2016. It is called American Male. It's only 6 minutes long, so I want you to go after you finish watching this lecture video and watch this 6-minute documentary. There's no words being spoken at all, but it really follows the life of this individual here that you see pictured, and how he interacts in very masculine spaces, lifting weights, interacting with the same gender, high-fiving, broing, violence, hitting each other, punching each other. He's also in a very fraternal space. He's in a frat. So how he drinks, how he interacts, and the ending is very interesting. So I want you to take a look at this. I also want you to take a look at all these examples that I put on here in your Blackboard as well too, of different types of advertisements that specifically show how men should behave, but more importantly, how men are policed through media, through advertising, through people around them on how to act like a man. And this then becomes very dangerous in some points, right? Because then you feel like you have to be violent, you have to be misogynistic, you have to have sex, you have to do all these different things in order to prove your masculinity. So we're gonna look at one really quick, and this is I believe a Miller Lite commercial with Meghan Markle before she became a royal.
Light beer.
More taste or less taste?
I don't care.
Kind of how your girlfriend doesn't care that you're borrowing her pants?
Called skinny jeans. Kind of in right now.
They're kind of not.
Man up and choose a light beer with more taste. Grab a triple hops brewed Miller Lite with that great Pilsner taste.
Hey, score still 21-32? Yeah, just like a jean size.
So again, here in this commercial, we can see that gender is being policed by not just the men around him and making fun of him, right? But also by Meghan Markle's character, by women as well too, right? So then men should dress a certain way and have a certain way in which they interact with the people around them. And of course, beer advertisements for different types of body products for men are then something that are considered as well too in ways to police masculinity. I always, when we have this class face-to-face, I ask the people in the class to tell me at the beginning of class what their favorite shampoo is. And 9 times out of 10, when I get to the male students in the class, they always say, I use Dove for men. I use this for men, right? There always has to be a man part of it. When it's the same shampoo, there might be a little bit of a difference in fragrance, but as long as the word man is on there, they feel more entitled to use that product, because then it keeps their masculinity intact, because masculinity is so fragile. And we'll talk about that later on this week as well too. The other day I went to the store and was going to buy toilet paper. We all need toilet paper, right? And I noticed that there was these wipes that you can buy that are like moistened wipes or whatever, but there's one specifically designed for men, and they're called dude wipes. And it's a black package, and it's very masculine. And of course, so that a man can go ahead and wipe their butt with something wet, they have to have a masculine package for it. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that all men are like this, but this traditional patriarchal type of hegemonic masculinity is that a man uses things that are made for men, that are built for men, and that are strong, and doesn't effeminate him in any sort of way. So I want you to go and look at all these different commercials and see the ways in which products are marketed towards men in a very hyper-masculine way to get them to buy the product. Also, something to consider is when we think about who is the most desirable in terms of men in pop culture and in our, yay, the lights came on. In pop culture and in our society, we can look to those individuals that are put on different magazine covers, those individuals that are chosen to be the leading roles in movies, right? These hyper-masculine men who are the superheroes and save the day. And usually they're very thin, they're muscular, They're fit, they're middle-aged, they're white, they're cisgender, right? They embody what it means to be masculinity. So when the Sexiest Man issue comes out every single year, we have one in Maxim magazine, we have one in GQ, and it ranks the sexiest man alive. And 2 years ago, we saw that David Beckham was on the #1 spot. But under him was Justin Timberlake, Reed Scott, Idris Elba, Sam Heughan, Justin Theroux, Charlize Theron, Jussie Smollett, Jake Gyllenhaal, Nick Jonas. So what we can see from this is that, again, not a lot of people who are LGBTQ, not a lot of people who are minorities and of color, or even disabled. So again, what is this prototype, the cultural template of what masculinity is? And then how do we, as society, then dictate what that performance of man should be, and how do we police it, right? Specifically here, we're looking at media. So then, of course, we think about how this type of performance then requires some sort of validation, whether that's war, insurrection, deviancy, right? Men have the right to sexual conquest. They're promiscuous, they take what they want. And we see this happening over and over through different types of movies, right? Who is the protagonist? Who's the hero? How do they act? How do they perform gender? Men have been removed from this supposedly authentic sphere of action and purpose, and have thus been forced to reassert their identity, attempts at retrospective recomposition, a true masculinity. And we see this happening a lot right now, post 2016, where we see the Me Too movement happening, and men starting to feel threatened and coming back and saying, no, how do we reclaim our masculinity and get back to the top of the hierarchy? Not realizing that being equal and equitable takes nothing away from them. But again, when we think about this theory in terms of hegemonic masculinity and this hierarchy, we see how individuals at the top can be threatened that they're going to lose their space and kind of go down the ladder as well. Role norms are understood as culturally constructed expectations about behavior, right? So then how do we think about being a man? How do we affectively feel towards it? And then in turn, how do we behave? How do we perform gender in certain spaces, right? Especially when we're around our bros, when we're around our family, when we're around these very social spaces where masculinity then becomes something that is priority, more salient part of our identity. How do we then enact that? Now, all of this theory isn't to say that there is one way in which you should be a man, right? Because when we think about traditional hegemony and traditional patriarchy, there is one way to be a man. But what I want you to think about is how are men being portrayed, not just in terms of masculinity on the media, but also intersectional types of identities, right? Men who are of various ethnicities and races, abilities and disabilities, sexual orientations, all these different things that shape what it means to be a man. And how is that being portrayed in conjunction with the medium? Is it TV? Is it film? Is it streaming media? Is it music? And then also, what is the show and what are they trying to convey, right? Is there just one man in the show? Is there nothing but men? Are they all the same race, same color, same masculinity? How is that then being performed? Thanks.